The rain came down in sheets that afternoon, turning the city streets into rivers of despair, but Marcus Hayes barely noticed as he stumbled out of the gleaming corporate tower, his rejection letter clutched in trembling hands. He had worn his only good suit, the one he'd bought from a thrift store and carefully pressed the night before while his 7-year-old daughter Lily slept in the next room, and he had walked into that interview with the kind of desperate hope that only a father 3 months behind on rent could understand. But hope, as Marcus was learning, didn't pay the bills, didn't put food on the table, and certainly didn't impress the stone-faced hiring manager who had barely looked up from his phone long enough to tell Marcus that his 2-year gap in employment made him unsuitable for the position. The gap existed because Marcus had spent those 2 years caring for Lily after her mother left them both without a backward glance, choosing her freedom over the family she'd helped create, and Marcus had made the only choice a loving father could make, putting his career on hold to be everything his daughter needed. Now, as the rain soaked through his threadbare suit and the weight of failure pressed down on his shoulders, Marcus wondered if love alone would be enough to keep them from losing everything. The interview had been his last real shot at stability, a junior analyst position at Sterling Global Industries that would have meant health insurance for Lily, a chance to catch up on the mounting debts, maybe even the possibility of moving out of the cramped studio apartment where his daughter did her homework on a card table because they couldn't afford a desk. He had prepared for weeks, staying up late after tucking Lily into bed, studying market reports and financial statements by the dim light of their single lamp, teaching himself the software programs the job required through free online tutorials. But none of it had mattered because the hiring manager, a man named Richard with cold eyes and a colder demeanor, had made his decision before Marcus even sat down, judging him not on his potential or his intelligence or his desperate willingness to work harder than anyone else, but on a resume gap that represented the most important work Marcus had ever done, raising his daughter alone through her mother's abandonment and the grief that followed. If you believe in second chances, in the power of kindness to change lives, in fathers who sacrifice everything for their children, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world, and it helps us share more stories that matter. Now, let's continue with Marcus's journey. Marcus stood on the sidewalk outside the building, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead, not knowing where to go or what to do next. He had exactly $43 in his bank account, enough for maybe a week of groceries if he was careful, if he skipped meals himself to make sure Lily had enough. The electricity bill was overdue, the landlord had already given him one extension he didn't deserve, and Lily's school was asking for money for a field trip that Marcus knew she desperately wanted to attend, but would never ask for, because she'd learned, far too young, that money was something they didn't have. He thought about her face that morning, the way she'd hugged him extra tight and told him she knew he'd do great in his interview, the way she'd drawn him a picture of a stick figure in a tie with a gold star on it and written "World's Best Daddy" in her careful 7-year-old handwriting. The memory of that drawing, taped to their refrigerator, made his chest tighten with a pain that had nothing to do with rejection and everything to do with the terrifying possibility that his love might not be enough to protect her from the harsh realities of their situation. He didn't hear the footsteps behind him at first, didn't notice the tall figure emerging from the building, didn't realize anyone had followed him into the rain until a voice cut through the storm, deep and commanding but somehow gentle. Marcus turned to find himself face to face with Alexander Sterling himself, the billionaire CEO whose name was on the building, whose face appeared in business magazines and financial news broadcasts, whose success story was the kind of legend that seemed impossibly distant from Marcus's own struggle. Alexander Sterling stood in the rain without an umbrella, his expensive suit darkening with water, his silver-streaked hair dripping, and his eyes, sharp and intelligent, fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made Marcus forget to breathe. The CEO's presence was overwhelming, not just because of his wealth or power, but because of something in his expression, a recognition that Marcus couldn't understand, a sadness that seemed to mirror Marcus's own. Alexander had been in his office on the 42nd floor, reviewing quarterly reports, when he'd happened to glance out the window and see Marcus standing in the rain below, shoulders slumped in defeat, and something about the image had struck him like a physical blow. He'd spent 20 years building his empire, surrounding himself with yes-men and carefully curated success, but in that moment, looking down at the broken figure of a man who'd just been rejected from a junior position in his own company, Alexander remembered what it felt like to have nothing, to be dismissed, to fight for survival with everything you had and still come up short. His own father had raised him alone after his mother's death, working 3 jobs to keep food on the table, sacrificing every dream he'd ever had so that Alexander could go to college, could have opportunities, could become something more than another statistic of poverty and struggle. His father had died 15 years ago, before he could see the empire Alexander built, before he could know that his sacrifices hadn't been in vain, and Alexander had spent every day since trying to honor that memory, trying to be worthy of that love. Now, standing in the rain in front of Marcus, Alexander pulled the rejection letter from Marcus's hand and tore it in half. Marcus stared at him in shock, unable to process what was happening, unable to understand why one of the richest men in the country was standing in a thunderstorm, ruining a suit that probably cost more than Marcus's yearly rent, to confront a failed job applicant. Alexander's voice was rough when he spoke, asking Marcus to tell him about the gap in his employment, asking him to explain what he'd been doing for 2 years, and Marcus, with nothing left to lose, told him the truth. He spoke about Lily, about her mother leaving, about choosing to be present for his daughter during the most formative years of her life, about reading to her every night and helping with homework and attending every school event and being both mother and father because that's what she needed. He spoke about the guilt of falling behind financially, the shame of thrift store suits and overdue bills, the constant fear that his best wouldn't be good enough to give her the life she deserved. Alexander listened to every word, the rain pouring over both of them, creating a private world where titles and wealth didn't matter, where 2 fathers stood in shared understanding of what it meant to sacrifice everything for the ones you love. When Marcus finished, his voice breaking on the last words, Alexander placed a hand on his shoulder and told him something that changed everything. He told Marcus that the man who'd rejected him would be clearing out his desk by morning, not because Alexander was vindictive, but because anyone who couldn't see the value in a father who chose his child over his career, who couldn't recognize dedication and sacrifice and the kind of character that couldn't be taught, had no place making hiring decisions in Alexander's company. He told Marcus that he was offering him a position, not the junior analyst role he'd applied for, but something better, a role in leadership development where Marcus's life experience, his resilience, his understanding of what really mattered would be assets rather than liabilities. But more than that, Alexander told Marcus about his own father, about the sacrifices that had shaped him, about the guilt he carried for all the years his father had struggled while Alexander was too young to help. He told Marcus that seeing him standing in the rain had been like looking through a window into the past, seeing his own father's struggles reflected back at him, and he couldn't walk away from that, couldn't let another devoted father slip through the cracks of a system that valued resume gaps over character. The position came with a salary that made Marcus's knees weak, benefits that would cover Lily's health care and education, and something even more valuable, a mentor who understood that being a good father wasn't a weakness but the greatest strength a man could have. Alexander also wrote a personal check for an amount that would cover all of Marcus's overdue bills and give him a cushion to breathe, to recover, to start fresh without the constant weight of financial terror. If this story has touched your heart, if you've felt the struggle of trying to do right by your family, if you believe in the power of compassion to transform lives, please show your support by liking this video and sharing it with someone who needs hope today. And please, take a moment to leave a comment telling us about a time someone showed you unexpected kindness. Your stories matter. 3 months later, Marcus sat in his new office at Sterling Global, a space with a window that overlooked the city, with a photo of Lily on his desk in a real frame, her gap-toothed smile radiating pure joy. She'd gone on that field trip, had started gymnastics. Classes she'd always dreamed of, had friends coming over to an apartment that had proper furniture and a bedroom of her own. But the greatest change wasn't in their circumstances, it was in Marcus himself, the way he carried himself with renewed confidence, the way he'd stopped apologizing for choosing fatherhood, the way he'd learned to see his sacrifice not as a gap, but as a foundation. Alexander had become more than a boss. He'd become a friend, a fellow father who understood that success meant nothing if you lost yourself along the way. The story of the billionaire CEO who chased a rejected applicant into the rain spread through Sterling Global, becoming legend, changing the company's culture from the inside out. New policies emerged valuing life experience alongside traditional qualifications, family-friendly practices that acknowledged that employees were human beings with responsibilities and hearts that extended beyond spreadsheets and profit margins. And Marcus, who had stood in the rain certain he'd lost everything, discovered that sometimes rejection is just redirection, that sometimes the lowest moment becomes the launching point for transformation, that sometimes one person's compassion can rewrite another's entire destiny.